Hi, everyone. All right, so this is an open discussion on diversity. I'm nervous. And that's the reason why the screen has an open Word document. Because when one's invited to have an open discussion, one doesn't want to come and give you a PowerPoint presentation. I have to figure out what you want to talk about and try to facilitate a safe space to talk about that. Now, when you all registered, the description of this session was, join us in cultivating an open and safe space where participants may explore, share, and co-develop best practices on diversity, equity, and inclusion. Our goal, learn and collaborate together in order to topple barriers and create a sense of belonging for all who work in or visit judicial environments. So we got all of our nonprofit catchphrases in on that one, and we're all checked up. So I think I earned my salary, at least for writing those sentences. But this is a tough time to have conversations about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And it's a tough time not only because there are people who want to change or no longer have such discussions, but truth be told, in my line of work, there are a lot of people who have monetized and commercialized and trivialized these discussions too. And it's why I can be a little bit more flip about nonprofit speak, because oftentimes we are confronting rather unserious and pro forma discussions on a very serious and important topic and something that's very important to get right. And one of the reasons why I think it's important to get right is because I've really stopped calling it only diversity, equity, and inclusion. I've started to use this term that's increasingly in use, which is belonging, right? Giving everybody a sense that they belong. And it's such a subjective and individualistic analysis, but I think the power of the analysis is that it asks you to really start with yourself. What does it take for me to feel like I belong here, right? What do I need to feel like I belong? Now, some people only need a paycheck to feel like they belong at their workplace, and that's fine. But others need a lot more. I think one of the things that we certainly all need, however, is a sense of safety and a sense of sustainability, that we can sustain ourselves emotionally, economically, from a job performance and advancement perspective here. When people interact with your environments, they also have feelings of safety and sustainability. So those are difficult things for us to try to work with respect to other people. So I really want us to really approach this conversation thinking about what it takes to get to those ends for ourselves. And I think that if we focus on what it takes for you to belong, and we open our ears to what it takes for other people to feel like they belong, then maybe we might have some solutions out there. Now, any conversation about difficult topics requires a set of ground rules. Most of my conversations are about domestic violence, sexual assault, sexual harassment, stalking, human trafficking. So I really come and bring smiles in all the rooms that I speak of, all right? But when you're talking about gender-based violence, power-based violence, statistically, you're usually talking to rooms where there are people who have had those experiences. So you want to create a safe space. When you apply those to questions of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, and when you speak of it both in the context of violence and outside the context of violence, you know you're talking to rooms where statistically there are people who've experienced discrimination and animus on the basis of their immutable characteristics, right? The things that you can't change. Your gender, right? Your race, your sexual orientation, your gender identity. In some cases, it even can trickle into your economic situation, how you look, right? Your weight, everything. Those are the things that really get to our bare bark, right? So we want to be able to say, as we have a conversation in a room where you're all lined up and you're talking to me and I'm standing up here, but I'm sticking around up here because I want to be able to be closer to the computers. We want to be able to at least create as safe space as possible so that people can say the things that matter, even if they may hurt or sting, and we all can receive those with as open of a mind and heart as possible. So the first ground rule that I would petition you all to agree to is that requests for clarification are encouraged, right? If somebody says something and you don't get it, if I say something and you don't get it, or it rubs you the wrong way, or if you want to give somebody a second chance, raise your hand. Sometimes when someone gets a chance to rephrase something, they may be able to give you a window into what their true intent is. Second, leave with your experiences, leave with your learning, but leave the stories here, right? So take away your learning, take away your takeaways, but the stories have to stay here. That's a fancy way of saying that this should be as confidential of a space as possible. Now, sometimes you might have to talk to your friend about something that happened. Hey, somebody said something that really hurt my feelings. Let me get some support. That's fine, but we don't want to go out there after a meeting like this to say, can you believe what they said? Oh my gosh, that was terrible, gossiping. Because then that impugns upon the safety of this space, and in future conversations, people may not be as open. But at the same time, you have to understand that if you say something that rubs someone the wrong way, that the impact actually does matter, regardless of your intent, right? When you're hurt, what's the last thing that you really want to hear from somebody? Well, I didn't mean it. Well, I know you didn't mean it, but I was still hurt, right? So impact matters. Focus on the impact, and we can worry about the intent in its proper place. Give space and take space. That's just another way of saying don't talk too much. And if you haven't spoken, say something, right? Help us make sure that we are having as many voices in the room as possible. And all voices are needed and encouraged and welcome into a conversation like this is the last one. So can we all agree? A little thumbs up, hands up to those as our ground rules. All right, great. So now, I am here now in a room that has an organization's invited me to talk about diversity initiatives, and it's an open discussion. And the question that you all might want to know right now is, what are we going to talk about, right? I don't know. I literally don't know. I know a couple of you. I've been in rooms with a few of you, but I have no idea what you want to talk to with me about today. I don't know why you're here, why you came in this room. I heard that the snacks were going to be really good. I'm sad that I missed them, but I get some afterwards, right? But what are we going to talk about? Now, here's the pathway that I want to take you through, and as you think about the topics that you're going to put on the table, right? We are going to begin by assessing what topics you want to talk about. What's important to you in your work when it comes to questions of diversity, equity, and inclusion? What are the problems that you're seeking to solve? What are the advancements that you're seeking to bring? What are you curious about? What are you worried about? What's going great? What's going wrong? Right? We're going to get that range of things, and I'm going to try to make a list of them. And then we're going to try to group and distill that list a little bit into one big question that seems to be the biggest question out there, right? And then once we do that, we're going to have a conversation about what to do about that question. What are some solutions? What are some ideas? Where are our resources? What do we need to research? What can we do to begin to tackle that problem, right? And then we're going to pick something from that as the best thing that we can do to tackle that problem. And then time's going to run out. So what you're going to do is you're going to hopefully go back to wherever you came from and maybe try that thing out. And then if everything works out, I can check back with the folks here at NACM and maybe send an email to all of you and find out if anybody tried something and how it went. And that's the best that we can do in 70 minutes, right? So that's our journey today. What do you want to talk about? What are your concerns? What's going on out there? What are our topics for discussion today? Let's make a list. Floor is open. Yes?
Providing equal access to all parties to the courts.
Okay, I'm gonna go back up here so I can type.
Sorry, are we providing equal access to the courts for everybody?
Is everyone receiving equal access to the courts? Oh, I did good that time. So what's going to happen now is y'all are going to see how bad of a typist I am. And I did that one without any red squiggly lines. So I must be hitting my stride. All right. Is everyone receiving equal access to the courts?
A question we've been getting a lot is, What are some of the court-based diversity committees tackling? What are the key issues that they're taking on?
There it is. So what's going on out there? What are people confronting, and what are the issues that your individual diversity committees are tackling?
Pushback. Over the last several months, I think many of us might be seeing considerable and in some cases organized pushback against diversity, equity, and inclusion. How do you address that?
The question that made me scared to come here today. How to address pushback. Someone's getting their steps in today. Thank you.
I'd like to have some conversation around authenticity and at all levels of the organization. Like, how do you cut through from a judge to a clerk to be able to have authentic and real conversations around diversity and inclusion and the expansiveness of that?
I like that one. Yeah. I really like that one because I'm wondering about that question a lot too in my work, right? Sometimes it feels like folks are there to go along to get along, but how do you really get to the core? Any other topics? What's on your mind? Let's go a few more. We got right here in the back.
One thing I think about a lot is how, as a supervisor, I can facilitate that conversation with staff that I supervise and what the appropriate way to approach that conversation is.
All right. Right here.
And I'll just piggyback onto that one as more of how do we go about creating a safe place or safe space environment and the ability to receive and give one's perspective, especially receiving perspectives from those who have been marginalized.
I stole one of the mics up here. Do we want to have two of these out here just to make sure? Marginalized was a word that was going to be a goner from the get-go, so. And don't ask me to type strategy, it's over. I tried strategy so wrong, autocorrect is like, what are you doing? We have no idea. Go ahead.
The low percentage of minority court leaders, which is not representing the people we are serving.
Yeah. All right. I'm still worried about marginalized. So I'm going to right click that and get that right. The low percentage of minority court leaders. And we can be real and comment on the room. You know, I'm just going to just be real and see what I'm seeing. So I'll just name it, right? So thank you for that. Anything else? Okay.
Similar to the how to address pushback, but how to address sort of tokenizing and putting a person in there and then not listening to anything that they say.
Yep, yep. Yeah, that's very, very painful from the point of view of the person in that position. As this is a safe space, I can say that I actually just stepped down, from my well-meaning organization's equity committee because it didn't matter what I said, right? So you don't get the mascot if you're not listening to if I don't get to play the game, right? Come on. So thank you for bringing that up. Anything else? All right. Well, wow. One on the chat. What's it?
It's how to acknowledge and address in an authentic way the experiences of our colleagues and community members who have experienced discrimination and bias in the court. Acknowledge, address, proclaim our position, and then follow through.
repeat that for you?
I'll just keep it like that, right? It's similar, right? Basically, read it again just so I can make sure I have all, because there's a second piece. What's the second clause? Because they're really talking about how to authentically address people who have been marginalized. And then what was the second part?
Acknowledge, address, proclaim our position, and then follow through.
Okay, and then what happens after that, right? So it sounds like accountability.
I just want to add to that also then when you're in management, how do you do that navigating the HR piece of it when you can't tell them what is being done?
So practical limitations such as HR. Yeah, so when HR has confidentiality requirements, and how do people feel that there's an accountable process despite the fact that there might be legal requirements that's being conducted behind closed doors? Sure. All right. So now, how do we get this to our central problem? And I think I would suggest that Jude, who's one of the people whose names I can call who's left, pose this question first, right? Which are the issues that the committees are tackling? What are the key issues that they're taking on? So my question for you is, first of all, how many of you all have people who are involved in some sort of committee or leadership body at your workplace who are actively confronting these issues? Okay, and how many of you don't? So it looks like it's about maybe 70-30, 65-35. All right, so for those of you who have committees that are tackling these issues, do the other issues that have been indicated, are they on the agenda? Or do you feel like they're tackling things that aren't the top issues here? So somebody who feels like their committee isn't confronting the issues of concern here. Raise your hand if you feel like your committee isn't. Okay, so these two individuals right here, let's talk with you. What is your committee confronting if they aren't confronting these things?
It's a great question.
So what are y'all doing?
I wish we knew.
Yeah. So they're what are they talking about? They're putting on like Black History Month commemorations, or
sort of. We have a book club, which I think is helpful.
Yeah.
I mean, those are positive things,
Yeah.
right? But I think what we've been in discussion about for a while now is like we need some tangible things that we can do outside of conversations, and conversations are really helpful. But I feel like in our particular case, I don't want to call it a token because I truly hope it's not, you know. But it doesn't feel like it has a lot of momentum to change things.
Gotcha. Are y'all in the same place?
Yes.
Okay. And for those who have committees, I think that the hardest question here is someone's had an experience and they're upset now because they can't communicate with the individuals who are responsible for addressing that experience, the HR question, right? So there's someone who's actively feeling marginalization and they aren't feeling satisfied by the process because the process has strictures. How many people's committees are dealing with that issue? All right. So we're getting somewhere right now, right? So there's a few things that come up here with respect to authenticity, right? Real conversations, authentic conversations, a desire to create a safe space, right? Now, the other issue that comes in that is this question of tokenization, which is also connected to my friends here's comment about leadership, right? So for those of you who are dealing with committees, are you confronting the question of tokenization and representation? Raise your hand if your committee is confronting that. Okay, so let's, if you don't mind, how is your committee dealing with the concerns that we've heard today about tokenization of those who might be in some form of representation and or broad-based lack of representation by groups that are experiencing marginalization? How's your committee confronting that?
Well, I'm with Thomson Reuters, and that is one of a big objective of ours is to make sure we're not tokenizing leaders that are in the BIPOC community, and really giving them a strong voice in our path forward as a company.
Do you have an example of a step that's taken in that regard? I'm putting you on the spot.
I would say authentic conversations.
Okay.
Opportunities to hear from these leaders what's important, their vision, what they need from other employees to feel supported. And I'm trying to think.
Yep.
We have so many sessions, and I love them. From like Deborah Lee. Can't remember her role. Some of you may.
BET.
Yeah. And so having those opportunities for all employees, all employee town halls to hear from leaders in the BIPOC community, what is needed is helpful too. To start opening up our minds a little bit.
Yep. And I agree, it is very helpful. And so I'm going to put you on the spot now. And I'm not doing this to rebut you or cause a problem with you, okay? So trust me on this. Now, you came hard.
Yep.
And I seconded you.
Yes.
So let's talk about it. Are they engaging in conversations at your workplace?
No.
Okay, interesting. Because I thought you were going to say yes.
No, they're not. And the reason I came hard is because I'm from Pennsylvania. And I'm the first and only Black court administrator in our state.
Wow.
Okay. Now,
it's crazy for Pennsylvania. I'm from South Carolina, so I'm shocked.
Yeah. I'm humbled. I'm humbled. But it's more important to me that I'm not the last.
Okay.
So I need to have those conversations, but I started those conversations with our judges. And we started having those conversations around the Black Lives Matter and George Floyd. And then they started coming to me and saying, wow, I didn't know. And I said, well, you never asked. And you don't know how I feel when I'm driving to work. For example, I said, I drive to work 45 minutes a day. And when I drive to work in my suit, I'm fine. But if I go like this and I get stopped by a cop, it's a different story.
Yeah.
Or if my children get stopped by a cop, that stop is going to be different than your child. So I try to explain it to them that way and give them those examples.
Sure.
And my president judge and I, we have a real good relationship. So we can talk about it. We've had those tough conversations. And I was going to ask this gentleman, what kind of conversations are you having? Are you having those tough conversations like I'm talking about now?
All right. Let's ask him.
That's what I'm talking about. That's what you have to have. So you know how I feel as a Black man and a leader in this court.
It's a great question because I've struggled with this. We were literally at just my own department. Our management staff was talking about this a couple weeks ago. So the diversity, we have an office of diversity, equity, inclusion that's fairly new, and it's encountered a lot of resistance from the community because the county government's spending money on it.
What state are you from? Sorry,
Michigan.
You're from Michigan, okay.
So, and I'm an elected official who has a department within the county. So it's kind of like this weird bifurcated relationship. And we see the DEI office and this cultural intelligence committee doing things, but they're not really, necessarily engaging with the departments in a way that I feel like is helpful. But I've honestly asked the question to myself, like, what should I be doing? I mean, I have a diverse staff, but we have not had conversations. And that's on me, right? I could easily initiate a conversation, but I don't think I know what I'm doing, and I don't want to
You have to have somebody have that conversation with. And
if
someone like myself who you can have that conversation with, that's great. But I can say all I want in my jurisdiction and throughout the state, but I need someone like you be next to me to second that.
But you hear what you both just did there. So one of the things that you said was the reason why you hadn't had those conversations because nobody asked.
Right.
One of the things he just said is he doesn't know what to ask.
Exactly.
All right.
No, that's true.
Now, we're getting somewhere, right? And we got to get to this resistance too, because he might want to ask, he might not know what to ask, but somebody might be telling him he can't ask, right?
Yeah, that's true.
Go, you about to say something? No, him. No, I felt that. No, you're good.
Yeah, no.
He's like, oh, you say something now.
I think it's a great point. I mean, and the resistance is more like political, right?
Yes.
And it is what it is. I think if you're going to do the right thing, you can't care about that. You know, there's obviously you have to be strategic thinker at some degree, but at some point you have to make a stand for what's right. And I guess where I struggle is, you know, I don't want to risk offending someone
somebody, right.
a lot.
Yeah.
So I think about that a lot. I don't want to go into something assuming that I do know what questions to ask or how to start a conversation. And maybe it's a matter of engaging more with our diversity department to say, like, you know, I need your help. You're now, you know, you're on the payroll. So maybe I should be expecting something more there as well. But again, it does start with me, right? I'm not saying that.
All right. So let's think about, let's create a composite person now. We have someone, who's my HR person, right? Because I'm so glad you brought that up. We have someone who has felt like they have been discriminated against and they are in a active process. And they are being told by those who preside over that process that, you know, we're doing the best that we can, but we can't really, you know, just have to wait, right? That person has experienced the terror of being concerned about getting killed in a traffic stop. Outside of this experience with discrimination, that person might be ambiguously brown like me and has been accused of everything from being an immigrant to a terrorist to a gangbanger, right? You can pick your hatred and put it right here if you want, right? So they're bringing that experience to the table. And their workplace also has been having conversations, but there's also a little bit of a murmur that the conversations aren't very authentic. Okay? Does that sound like a problem that we all can see or sign on to as a problem that can be confronted? Is that, you know, is that something that starts to put together our list here? Right? We have something going on in this environment by form of a committee, by form of conversations. The conversations feel a little hollow. They feel a little hollow because some people are concerned about offending folks. Some people are tired of being the only one in the room. But there's stuff also going on here. So the people who are experiencing this may feel that, you know, hey, y'all think you're doing something here, but you're not really doing anything because I'm still having my experience here and outside of this workplace. And so I think there's a whole, you ever seen that meme that goes around of all the Spider-Men pointing at each other? There's that kind of thing going on. Does that make sense as a problem? Have I picked up a lot of, oh, and you know, and then there's a protest outside the courthouse about all this. I don't know. Go ahead. What's going on outside?
We have a comment from, or a question from Rebecca. How do we have these conversations and make progress without exhausting and burdening the BIPOC people by making them constantly explain their experience to white people?
Yep. Great question. So I think that fits into what I'm saying here though, right? Because there's a frustration. What I'm trying to get at here is it appears that the frustration's hitting a structural wall. And it's hitting the structural wall accompanied by a lot of baggage in an environment that at least on paper feels like they're making progress on the topic. That's what I'm dealing with here. Does anybody think that that's missing an important element of the priorities that we established? All right. Now, I think we did it. I think we have a problem. Whew. All right. Now, what do we do about it? Right? Let's start with the structural wall, because that's the point of ultimate frustration for the person who we think we are trying to help but doesn't feel helped. What do we do about the structural wall? Confidentiality is real. Legal limitations are real. Presumption of innocence is real. Employee handbooks are real. False allegations are real. True allegations are real. The time that it takes and the money that it takes to truly look under the hood are real. Witnesses who do and do not participate constructively are real. But someone knows that something's going on here. So let's give an example. Why don't someone give me an example of a relatable and reliable HR complaint that might be in this space? A person from a marginalized group has now brought up with themselves the gumption and the power to complain formally that they have been wronged in your workplace. What's the nature of that complaint? All right. We'll wait for the mic for me because we got a webcam, folks.
There was a complaint, and I had to open a Nondiscrim investigation. There was a group of probation officers, 5 probation officers in an office. And one of the probation officers said in that conversation, "I do not agree with interracial marriages."
Well, okay. Well, that's personal.
That's what he said. Said to 4 other probation officers, "I do not agree with interracial marriages." One probation officer confronted him and said, "Do you realize she's married to a Hispanic man?"
Yeah.
And that's how the complaint went to the chief, and then it came to me, and then I opened a Nondiscrim investigation.
Okay. So was it the person who was married to an interracial marriage, or the person who witnessed it that made the complaint, if you can say? Or did they
the
both?
person who was interracial marriage. She was
Okay.
in interracial marriage.
All right.
And then it was seconded by the person who confronted him as well.
Okay. So a statement has been made that goes to your core, right? Who you're married to. And the reason why I say that that's personal is because my parents weren't allowed to get married in 1963. So believe it or not, I'm 41 years old. This is an ancient history. My parents tried to get married before Loving, and they couldn't do it. They had to go to Michigan to get married. They weren't allowed to do it in South Carolina. So this is personal for me. So someone's heard a comment that is directly offensive to their most important relationship at work by a colleague, which arguably, depending on how frequently that might happen, or depending on whatever your workplace code of conduct might be, we could agree that that's the trappings of a hostile work environment, right? You might have questions about to what extent in the probation context can you feel safe around your coworker? Will your coworker protect you? Does your coworker have supervisory authority over you? Can your coworker set up a circumstance that limits your advancement? So this is something that matters, right? We can get all, EEOC is a severe and pervasive. Did he keep saying it? But, for the purposes of this discussion, let's say that you all have determined at your judicial environment, your workplace, that for someone to make a comment like that in that space is at least worthy of query to see what's going on here because of the outcomes that happen with that. Go ahead.
Full disclosure, I also am in interracial.
Yep.
So
I suspect that you got married after 1967, though, right?
Yes, after 1967, but
Okay.
I have a very traditional family, and so
yes.
we have had our share.
Sure.
But I guess what I would bring it back to is the idea of belonging. Whether it's whether a rule was violated or not, whether somebody's whether there was prejudice there or not, we all carry some sort of bias in a lot of different ways in our lives. And that's not to minimize it, because I would take that very personally as well. But really to be more curious about how do we bring people together in an atmosphere of belonging if we're drawing lines about who we will associate with and who we will not associate with in our workplace based on our own values?
Yep. Right here. Thank you. Thank you all for helping me with the mics here. I've got this thing on, so I don't have to worry about it.
In that particular instance, I mean, and I think many examples we're probably going to hear today, I would also be a little concerned about the population of folks that this probation officer is supervising. They have some punitive authority over that population. And so I'd want to be, I'd at least want to have that as a part of the conversation.
All right, so we have our concerns. So what's happened now is the persons who were victimized by this comment, who are all subject to the concerns that we've all articulated, now want to know what's going on with the investigation. And you're saying, I can't tell you. They also want to know, how can somebody say something like that? We had a Black History Month commemoration here. We've got a committee. We went through some trainings. We did role play. And this person still feels that they have the capacity to make a ridiculous comment like that at the workplace. Oh gosh, we checked the sign-in sheet and they were at all the stuff. They were trained. So now we have our problem and now we're trying to get to the solution. And I don't think we're going to really solve the HR barrier right now. But I think what we can solve is the frustration that fuels the overflow that occurs at the HR barrier, which is you all have been talking a good game, but a probation officer still said something bold like that. And I'm actually going to try to integrate the pushback in now. Let's say then somebody went and they looked at the probation officer's Facebook page, which is conveniently public, and they are very much involved in the pushback to these conversations. So now the rumor mill, the gossip mill is alight. Everyone's saying, you knew or you should have known that this person was a problem. Hell, this person might even be tapping into that to start to get support for their position. Why shouldn't I be able to say that? Freedom of speech. This is a government body that I'm employed by. So although I still have a mangled understanding of the First Amendment that begins with the word Congress, I believe that I should be able to say whatever I want at a public employment circumstance, right? You all know what I'm talking about here. You all hear freedom of speech. Congress shall make no law, but it's a public place. I'm an employee. Oh. So now, let's think about it. What do we do? What do we do? What do we do to bring that word that you all keep saying, which is authenticity, to the conversation, to the committee, to the effort, so that, you know, as my friend here has indicated, that, you know, there's the first time that something happens, but you don't want it to be the last. You want this to be the last time something like that happens, but you certainly don't want it to be a circumstance that clears that workplace of people who may be offended by those circumstances, because that's usually what happens. Usually people who get a sense that that's what happens there don't last long, or they leave and word gets out and they don't try to go in the first place. So now we have to get to the point now where we're starting to throw out some solutions, and we're gonna pick one. So what do you do if you are in this environment with all of these dynamics that are going on? You've got a committee. The committee's authenticity is under attack because somebody feels emboldened, and they may feel emboldened by community pushback. And now all that is coming to a head by someone who's asserting a desire to want to be informed as to the status of the investigation, and they're facing a structural barrier that's probably an important one to preserve. Have I stumped you? I'm vamping for time because I don't have any solutions. Y'all got to say it. So let's throw some. Here we go. All right. All right. Let me go back up here and type poorly for you.
Yeah, thanks. Because that would be at my door. That's
okay.
what
Why
I
would
do.
that be at your door?
I'm the Chief Human Resources Officer
There you
for the
go.
organization.
All right.
And so there are some things short of saying to be able to say as an organization, we won't condone this behavior that marginalizes somebody so easily. How do you do that and show that as an organization, short of ending the employment relationship with somebody? Because that's certainly one way to do it. Let them go. And if it's bad enough, it's one I highly recommend because you don't condone it. But to do some really tough things, like there are some great coaching trainings out there about how you can have these conversations, how you can talk with folks about you can feel what you want to feel. You can believe what you want to believe. You can believe that I'm a woman and I shouldn't have anything but a chain that takes me to the kitchen and your bedroom, right? Fine, but you can't treat me like that at work. And so how do you have those conversations about what's appropriate in the workplace? And how do you, to your point about how do you school up some folks to have the vulnerability to ask the questions about, I think somebody else said curiosity. Can you help people have a conversation to say, in 2021, why? Where have you been living? Under a rock that you would think that interracial marriage is where you can really maybe have some mediations or some conciliations so that they can still function together as a team. I mean, I think when you say it was a probation officer, they really hear tough things about people in their lives all the time that are trying to make their lives right. And so going to some of the trainings that they would have, I would rely on some of those and take it back to appropriate professional behaviors to tie in with it, to depersonalize it. And then, of course, I would document it and say, you don't get 2 bites at these apple, and I will kick your glutamus maximus out of this door should this happen again. I have some words for that, too, that are more professional if anybody needs them.
Yeah, I bet. I'm rattled, and I didn't even do anything. All right, so that was a series of solutions, right? I think the first big question was, you want to send a message, so you want to send messages within your limitations. How to train people to be able, who feel that way, to be able to feel that way, but know when and how, and not to communicate that they feel that way, and why not communicating that you feel that way matters, which is what we already expressed. Although there's some challenges there, because when people keep things like that to themselves, but they're still dealing with client base and stuff, that could be concerning. So how do we create an opportunity for growth, curiosity, conciliation, when there are people like that in our midst, while doing that for the safety, maintain the safety of the person who's impacted?
So I'm curious how this solution brings us to the partnership that we observed over here earlier. So I get that we don't want prejudice and all of that in our workplace, but how does this solution give us a culture of belonging with diverse ideas and attitudes that we can be respectful towards, that we can be curious about, that we can help everyone feel like they belong in a respectful way? I mean, everybody comes to the work environment with their own set of beliefs, whether it be faith or whether it be their own personal experience or their choices about sexual preference, or their race. And so I don't know that I would agree that the answer is to remove an individual unless or until it's absolutely necessary, but that I would be more interested in a solution that brings belonging to the culture in a very respectful and authentic way that causes people to be curious so that you can partner together in understanding.
Sure. Well, let's think about that. Let's confront that at the point prior to that incident, right? So here's what we know. We have someone in your workplace who has the capacity to make a statement like that and feels that way, right? And the only difference between before and after they said it is you knew, you didn't know, and now you know, right? So the question is, how do we make sure that the people who could be hurt by hearing that statement still feel like they belong, right? How can the person who makes that statement feel like they belong and or at least get the help that they need to perhaps grow in that statement? And then also, how did the people who could be impacted by the sentiment underlying that statement feel like they belong when that person proceeds undetected at the organization? And so by way of training, by way of mediation post-statement, by way of declarations of what the organization condones, whatever it might be, I think that is really the hardest question. What's going on that happened to what could be done? What's the one thing that we can do to be in the space right before that statement's made to change the dynamic there? Because what we want, I think, is this. First of all, we want the individual to have at least some sort of constructive and productive exposure to people who are different from them, which is where we started, right? And I think we all understand that having people who are different from you is good for all of us because we all grow and we all evolve because of the experiences that we have there. So assuming that we're making steps in that regard, the real question is, if it's not just exposure to someone who's different from you, then what is it that puts someone in the position to be able to safely explore their concerns about interracial marriage without hurting the people who are likely to be hurt? And there's 2 in the room at a minimum who've already confessed that they would be very hurt by that. So we got to get a solution for that part. And I think we know we can't train it away, right? I think we know we can't hire it away. We can't fire it away, right? We can't investigate it away. And we've got, is this over 4:45 or 4:30? All right, so we got about 20 more minutes. And we got to find one thing we can do. What's the one? We got to still find one thing we can do. It doesn't have to be a big thing, but I want us to find one thing that you can try. Now we are found ourselves in the moments before someone makes a decision to make that statement. Now let's go ahead and do the disclaimer. There are bad people in the world. There are jerks in the world, right? There's, and Lord knows that the internet has really depressed me because I preferred the life before the internet when I didn't really know what everyone thought. It was a lot better, right? And scarier too. Because now I'm scared looking back. I'm like, oh my God, that's what you thought the whole time? You were nice to me. But the fact of the matter is, and this is going back to the pushback question, right? You're going to have people in your environment who are going to feel this way, and they're going to be emboldened by feeling this way. And what we want, because we're good people at least, I'd like to think is what we want is we don't want them to, you shouldn't feel that way and you get out of here, right? We want them to say, hey, listen, don't feel that way because it's not that big of a deal. Like I'm like, what are you doing? That's really what we want. We want the person to say, well, now that you have expressed to me how you feel about what's going on, I've listened to you and you're a good person, I'm a good person, we're friends, and you've told me what your experience is, and I feel safe with you and we've helped each other out. Now I actually feel a little less crazy than I did before about the topic at hand. And so thank you very much. I won't say it again. But how do you get the person to say it without driving everybody crazy and about making it all concerned? What's the solution? Are we at a stalemate? There's got to be something we can do, folks. Don't make me vamp anymore. Play the Jeopardy, Final Jeopardy music. Give me an idea. One thing. Doesn't matter what it is. There you go.
I feel like you touched on it a little bit, and I don't know how this would
all
play into a huge solution, but I think we're all in a place where when you know somebody, it makes it different, right? In a lot of cases, it makes it different. And people soften when they realize this person I know and love lives life this way or looks like this.
Mm-hmm.
And frequently it's getting people to that, I guess, that place of understanding.
Okay.
But is it the obligation of the woman who was wronged
to
do that? I don't think so.
Yeah.
So I don't know.
All right. And then
So
the
you can
thing
run
about
Jeopardy
knowing
music again, because that wasn't an answer.
No. But it's getting us somewhere, because also the thing about knowing somebody, right? Because we already declared an interest in making sure that the person who you know isn't tokenized and has the emotional labor of having to always explain themselves, which is, the story of my life. So I know how that feels. Also, we have a circumstance where there are people who could be in positions of authority available, right? And we have circumstances where you might live in the community, in the state, in the county, in an area where actually everybody is in fact the same, right? So then there's that first person who shows up who's slightly different, and then something happens. So how do we replicate? I'm going to propose that the solution in our proceedings with this committee structure, this training structure, is to replicate the power of knowing and loving someone for the purposes of personal transformation. That's the solution I'm going to propose. Replicate the power of knowing someone for the purposes of transformation. How do we replicate that when you might not be able to know somebody, or somebody might not be there to know, and or the person who is to be known doesn't quite want to be known because everybody always knows them and they don't want to be the only one known all the time because that's not their job. So now we're getting somewhere. How do we bring that into our engagements on these questions? That power. And it might be the answer to the question. Maybe that might be the thing to try in how you communicate, plan, and embark upon the discussions that you have about this. How do you replicate the power and the authenticity of knowing and experiencing and trusting somebody in that environment? And I think that's fascinating. One of the places that you see this actually working out, and it's probably because it is in the context of war, but it happens in the military, right? When somebody puts someone else's life in their hands, the blood is red, and that's all they're really concerned about at that point. So that's really knowing somebody. No one has time for that foolishness in that space, although people still have their issues. And we've got something from
We have a suggestion from
Okay.
Mary, and she's suggesting ongoing team building exercises.
All right, ongoing team building exercises. So let's talk about that. Where has team building worked? Because we know where it hasn't worked, and that's the trust fall. It never works for the trust fall. Trust fall is always a bad idea, every single time. So other than the trust fall, has anyone had an example of a team building exercise that's worked? Honestly, my team building exercises that tends to work is like, pressure and crisis. Usually, maybe that's my war example, right? But where does at least non-planned or planned team building work? Has anyone had an experience where they really saw a team gel around an activity or an experience? Thank you.
I think one of the most successful teams that I've had has been when one or two people were willing to be vulnerable about their opinion or their, we've already created a culture just through coaching of belonging in a way that everybody brings their own political beliefs and such to the table. And so then you can value someone else's opinion, and you can be inquisitive about that in a conversation that's much more authentic rather than drawing the same thing through instructions on a piece of paper or, playing some game or something. I think getting real, but it does take some work to get to a place where you can, where the majority of the people on your team can sit and have that conversation without getting offended or feeling hurt, and everybody's voice is heard or given an opportunity to be heard if they want.
Vulnerability, absolutely. And I have a follow-up on that, but I wanted to give you a chance to offer one too.
I was just going to say, not related to that, but just your question before, I think, and I hate to use the word that way, but not in which you said replicating the power of knowing someone, maybe not replicating, but taking advantage of the power of knowing someone, which means finding a common ground and being able to relate at some point on something. And it may not be about the topic that is the critical conversation, but if you find something else that you relate on, to be able to then move into having built a little bit of trust there and a little bit more of a relationship to then be able to have those crucial conversations.
Absolutely. I'm going to come back to you because you were vulnerable with us, and I'm going to pose a question based on these two statements. So thank you. It was the probation officer is there a possibility that the probation officer who made the provocative and offensive statement about their beliefs on interracial dating, that they were being vulnerable and that there's a way to find common ground somewhere to get to them? Was that a remote possibility with respect to how you can at least tell us the understanding of the fact pattern there? Is there a space for that there? Was there a space for that
Maybe, because he just started, he was like 6 months into the job, and the rest of the probation officers were there for a couple years.
Okay.
So maybe he was vulnerable to fit in. I don't know.
Okay.
But there were several concerns.
Of course.
After he made the statement and he was confronted, he doubled down and said specifically who he did not agree with, what races. It was black, white, and specifically.
Okay.
And my concern was what you said, that he had the authority to supervise people, minorities, and or people who are dating minorities. So that was a serious concern of mine. And in Pennsylvania, we have the Nondiscrim policy that all court employees sign, and our code of conduct for employees. They all sign it at the beginning, and in Northampton County, they sign it every year. So they're well aware of what my expectations are as the district court administrator. So the other concern I had is when I brought him in for the interview, he denied it completely.
Oh, wow.
So I couldn't even have that conversation with him like you're talking. So I said, hey, let's have this conversation. Tell me what you're thinking so I can try to help you. But he denied it after it was substantiated by 4 other officers at different times during different interviews by different people. My 2 deputies interviewed all these witnesses, and the chief probation officer interviewed all of them. And then I interviewed him at the end, and he denied it. And I even gave him the opportunity. I said, you know what? Take the weekend, think about it, and I'll let you amend your statement on Monday, 10 o'clock, date definite, that's it. Came in again, denied it.
Interesting. So yeah, and this is dangerous territory. So this is what we have to think through, right? Because on one hand, I don't want you all to process the question that I have as some sort of circumstance where the impact doesn't matter in that context, right? The impact still matters now. Someone might have been vulnerable. They might have said something that's deeply hurtful, and the people who were hurt by that had every right to be hurt. So let's keep that centered in our conversation. However, we're still trying to tackle this concern, which is how do we allow people to explore that? He knew he did something wrong, so that's when he went into the zone of deniability. He knew that his sustainability, all the things that I said earlier, his safety were all at risk. So that's why he went into that self-protective space. We knew that there were other people who were harmed and impacted by it, and immediately harmed and impacted by the way it was phrased, the doubling down, the later denial. So all that matters. But in the perfect world, what we really want to be able to do is we want to have some sort of capacity for people to get together and for someone to be able to know how to say, at least in as curious a way as possible, you know, in my work, sometimes this happens in your small group context, right? We'll put people in small groups for these types of things to happen. Hey, you know, these are my concerns that are related to whatever the race-oriented or identity-oriented topic is. And then the people who are impacted by that to be able to safely say, you know, that really just messed me up what you just said, and here's why. And then the person who said it just says, okay, I hear you. Tell me more, as opposed to, you shouldn't feel that way because I just meant so-and-so, and don't get mad at me and all that kind of stuff. And then also understanding that everybody, the whole time this can happen, any and everybody can always run and report to HR. And then that might be on your table when you tried the, super risky way that Aaron came by and proposed that you have these conversations. So don't cite me in your deposition, okay? There's no legal advice is being given in this proceeding. So that being said, right? I think that's getting to be where we are with respect to the solution that I'm going to suggest that you contemplate with your conversations here. And we're assuming representation. We're assuming representation by way of the solution. I'm not letting people get away with that. We're assuming representation to the extent to which it's allowed. You got to have people in the room to have the different experiences, or you have to put in the work required to have the voices of the different experiences if those people aren't present for whatever reason. So assuming representation. Now, how does someone begin to explore their vulnerabilities? And that can occur in two ways. The vulnerability of being able to express something that is on your mind that could be provocative in this space, and the vulnerability to express how that statement impacted you. Those are the two spheres of vulnerability here. And to be able to have that conversation and for us to witness two people see each other in that context. And I think from my experience, small groups are good at that. Regular and ongoing engagement is good for that. So you just can't have one morning a year when you're having your diversity, equity, inclusion PowerPoint or your online training, but you're actually having these conversations on a regular basis, right? And then very slow and deliberate efforts to set a framework for ground rules, as you saw me do here today, to get people into the space to have the conversation. And then finally, I think I have a new one here, which is really, I'm thinking through what you all are talking about, the power of knowing somebody, but it almost needs to be some sort of opportunity for a social aspect to it as well, right? Like, everybody hates having the birthday cake in the break room and all that, so I'm not talking about that, but something that's a little bit better than that, which is in the context of the conversation about these issues, a social aspect of that too. And sometimes small groups are good for that. I'll give you a tactic that I use and then I'll come to you. Sometimes when I know that small groups are done talking about something, I'll let them keep talking for 5 more minutes when I know they're talking about stuff that's not related to what I asked them to talk about, because they're getting along. They're laughing, they're having a good time. So what am I to stop you? There's probably something going on here that's going to be good. It's not all about me. It gives me 5 more minutes on my end too. So that's a little tactic. Go ahead.
I also wonder how we've talked a lot about HR, and we've talked about how this probation officer denied the actions, probably after being faced with punishment, right? So how do we take punishment out of these conversations? So if we're asking people to be vulnerable and be willing to be challenged, how do we remove the punishment aspect of that? And I don't know how we do that, but I think we do it, right? So I think that should be part of the discussion.
Absolutely.
As well.
Well, the way that we do it in the gender-based violence, power-based violence world is really to engage the person who is impacted in that exploration, right? So the first thing that you want to do is you want to flood the person who is impacted with all the support that you can offer. Resources, support, time, whatever it takes to get the person impacted in a safer and more comfortable circumstance. And that's just the right thing to do anyway. But then once you have that capacity, once they are feeling safer, then at that point, it's the victim agency, right? Really is, and you all may have seen in those contexts, you want to find out, what do you want to happen to the person? Do you want them fired? And, a lot of times they'll just say, I just want the person to know that was wrong and not to do it again. It's like, okay, well, that's good. That's interesting. So how do you find ways to do that? And how do you find ways to make sure that whatever you do to implement that was signed off by the person who was impacted? Obviously making sure that the person who was impacted knows that, no promises, You aren't in control in the way that you would say that in a nicer way and all that sort of stuff. It's not your decision to make. But if you do have an opening available for the person to say that there's an opportunity for conciliation and restoration here, and here's what it looks like, taking advantage of those openings with their support is great. What happens all too frequently, however, is that whatever decision that's made, especially if it's in that space, isn't made with the acquiescence of the impacted, which makes them even more frustrated that the person wasn't fired, because although in the back of their head, they didn't want the person fired, now they want them fired because you didn't fire them and you didn't ask me. And I'd be that way too. So that would be my experience with that. So we've got about 5 more minutes left. Is there anything from the chat? We're good? We got about 5 more minutes left, and I just want to kind of wrap a bow on this because I hope that we got somewhere with this, right? But what I think we got was, at least what I received from a room that I didn't know where we were going, was still in that space of experience and representation and the replication, as I said, of the power of actually knowing and authentically relating to someone. So I don't know if we got to how to practically implement that in your environments, but I hope a takeaway in whatever is going on there is to try to find opportunities for that sort of thing. And I think what we can agree with is that that's not a pro forma committee work. That's not something that can be put on an agenda. That's not something that is accomplished with some sort of box in the newsletter, with the fact of the day. That's something that actually requires continued conversation and then continued interrogation of the concept, like what we attempted to do here for 75 minutes, right? So what I would hope that you bring back, those who have organized bodies that are having these conversations, what I hope that you bring back to them is that question. Like, okay, look, we're talking about practices, we're talking about procedure, we're talking about hiring, we're talking about investigation, but we're really talking about getting along around here, right? So let's talk about it. And everybody might look at you like this, but push the issue. Let's talk about it. What does it take to get along here? What causes us not to get along here, right? And then secondarily, it seems to me that part of getting along requires what you said, which is really couched in notions of empathy, right? Like, in order for us to get along here, whether or not we're having the direct experience of someone in a position of power, if that's not present, how do we replicate the experience that happens there when there's someone at least in a position of power or in an equal position where you are essentially left no choice but to empathize with them because you're there with them, handling the matter at hand, hearing from them, having the give and take, and you respect them and you're listening, and there is inherent to that notions of empathy required, right? Not resistance, not pushback. So how do we build in empathy with respect to our outcomes? And then the third piece of that is this piece of vulnerability and the safety that's required for vulnerability. And there's a range of discussions that can be had. How do we foster safe conversations that allow people to say provocative things that won't get us in trouble, right? How do we foster structures to manage the impact of that so that people aren't hurt? And then when things happen, how do we give the people who are impacted some say over the outcomes with the hopes that notions of real and meaningful and genuine vulnerability aren't stomped on with punishment and exclusion, which is probably a lot of what's fueling some of the pushback. Some of it's not well-meaning, but some of it does come from like legitimate feelings of being shut down when someone actually may have not known better than what they said or felt in that context because it came from a real place. So that's my proposal. I hope it means something. I didn't type it up. Was this recorded? Like actually recorded too? Okay, good. So we'll look at the video. We're right at time. And I hope that somehow, some way here, there is something to try there. This was very experimental in my regard, but this is a problem that does not have a button that we can push, right? So my encouragement for you is to keep this conversation going in any way that you can. And also, as a final word, I think you all should thank and appreciate yourselves because we just really did it just this now. We just did it together. So if y'all can figure out a way to do what we just did here, wherever you go, then, I guess everything will be all right. All right? Y'all have a good one.